Oh. Hello. Hi, I'm Gage Peterson, a Utah local and camera enthusiast. And for those of you keeping track, this is my third cat mug to appear in a video. I'm quite happy with these ones. Today, we're here to talk about the cheap side of Sony lenses and the ones that I've used. It seems really crazy when you move to Sony from any other brand and you see just how expensive their Premier glass is. But if you do a little research and you take your time, there are really decent, cheaper lenses for the Sony E-mount system. Okay, for this, I'm gonna go in order from smallest millimeter to highest millimeter. So I have 20 millimeter, a 30 millimeter, a 50 millimeter, and a 135 millimeter. And those aren't the only lenses I'm gonna be talking about today. Without further ado, let's move to our smallest lens in the selection, my Sony E-mount. I'm saying E because this is not a full frame lens. My first Sony camera was the Sony a6500, and I was really moving over for the smaller form factor from Canon. This lens fit my needs perfectly for when I switched over. I was looking for a small camera that could get me back into photography, something that I could carry with me all the time. And this thing is only about 3/4 of an inch long. And that's insane. It barely, in 1 second. It barely makes this body a tiny bit bigger than the width it already is. I love this lens. It's really sharp. It doesn't have that much distortion for being a 20 millimeter, and if you use Lightroom, you'll clear that up as soon as you import it. It's tiny. Did I mention it was tiny? It's an f2, so it actually lets in a lot of light. I mean, if you're looking for a wide lens, but you don't want a fisheye or you don't want a super wide, this would be my go-to lens on an APS-C mount camera. This lens is awesome. I love it. This is always the one I put on me if I'm just gonna take the camera to somewhere where I am not necessarily looking to shoot, but I think there might be opportunities that I don't wanna miss. So, awesome, great little guy, fun. The last thing that I wanna note about this is the focus by wire. I hate focus by wire. I wish it wasn't a thing that existed in this world, but we have to deal with it. And this focus by wire is actually pretty decent considering the price point of the lens itself. It's nice and smooth. It feels like you're actually focus pulling. It's not as accurate as you want it to be. It's not as accurate as any manual lens in the world. If I took a second to practice, I bet I could rack focus with it pretty well. But its autofocus is good enough that you don't need to manual focus. So that's the best thing about Sony native mount lenses. Okay, let's move on to the second lens. The Sigma 30mm 1.4 DC-DN 52mm front mount thread comes with a thing. Lens. This is also an APS-C lens. According to DxO, this is the sharpest APS-C lens for Sony cameras. That does not mean that it is the sharpest lens available. You still have other lenses that DxO hasn't tested. You have full frame lenses that sometimes can actually be sharper on APS-C cameras. That being said, this thing definitely proves its worth. It is super sharp, nothing crazy stellar about it. The manual focus is trash, it is garbage. Don't use the manual focus, but it's autofocusing for a non-native lens is actually pretty impressive. It's a 1.4, so for APS-C cameras, it lets in that extra light that you really need sometimes when you're trying not to boost your ISOs very high. On a side note, the lens that I am filming with right now, the Sony 28mm f2, I think it's outperforming this lens to an extent that this might leave my bag. Its autofocus is incredible for a kit lens. It blows it out of the water, and it has a remarkable sharpness score on DxO. It is actually up there in like the top 15 lenses, which is insane for a $500 lens. Wide enough to be wide, but not too wide, and it leaves room for an ultra wide so that you kind of cover all of the bases if you're trying to buy primes. For me, I don't think it's worth having this lens and that lens in my bag because I can simply use that lens on both cameras and achieve different effects. It would be more like an average zoom on an APS-C lens, and then I have a wide on this camera. And I'd rather have a jack of all trades than have a bag that's breaking my back. Outperforms it in manual focusing, outperforms it in autofocusing, may not be quite as sharp on an APS-C camera body, but it's still really sharp. So that's all I have to say about these lenses. Let's move on to the next one. The 50mm 2.8 macro. I have not shot with the 1.8 50mm, the $200, $300 one. I forgot how much it is. It's nice to have a macro in your bag because sometimes you want to get closer and you just can't. This thing will definitely get closer. It is a 1-to-1. One thing I like about it is you don't necessarily need a filter because the lens is about this far back inside the camera body. So you shouldn't get much stuff on the glass or bump it into anything. It comes with a focus hold button. Awesome. I love lenses with focus hold buttons. I wish every single Sony lens had one. It's got an autofocus and a manual focus switch, something I love having on the lens so that you don't have to switch it on the body. It's just annoying to go in the menu, turn it on and off. It's got a range limiter, also very handy, especially when working with a macro. If you need to start filming something, you're probably not gonna be filming macro, so you can just throw it on to 0.3 meters to infinity and it will autofocus actually surprisingly well. The most notable thing about this lens is that its focus by wire is incremental. It does not guess how much you're trying to zoom in. It is kind of weird because it's kind of on a ramp. Say at the beginning of it, when you're focused the furthest away at infinity, from infinity to about, I'd say 2 feet away, it's a really small turn. It's probably like a half turn. So there's a lot of range. You can really nail your focus if you're really good at small movements with your fingers. And then from there, all the way to right in front of the lens, it's like 10 turns. It's crazy, or more. It's so that you can really nail the focus and you have lots and lots of control for focusing macro, but it doesn't just help you with macro, it helps with focus pulling when you're shooting video. It's actually surprising how well this focus by wire is. I wish they were all incremental like this, not kind of guessing, because other Sony lenses, they will guess. Say if you move this distance, if you move a quarter turn on a normal Sony lens, it also looks at your speed. So if I do it really quickly, it could go from infinity all the way to its closest point. But if I do it really slowly, it could go from infinity to like just before infinity. I love this lens because it doesn't do that. And I actually just really like this lens. It's awesome. It lets in a lot of light. It's a 2.8, so it's really good for a full frame. It is a full frame lens, by the way. Awesome little guy. It costs a little more than the 1.8. Doesn't get as much light, but you get really good focus by wire. You don't have to necessarily buy a filter for it. I think the 50mm 1.8 has a focus hold button, so I can't really say that that's better. Let's move on to the final lens. The Samyang 135 2.0 beast of a lens. This thing is heavy. It's probably not quite a pound, but it's still pretty heavy. The focus ring on this thing, super hard to turn. This is actually easier than when I bought it. It is tough to turn all the way. It's got a massive front element on it that mine is kind of lacking in cleanliness right now. If you can handle manual focusing and you have a full frame or an APS-C camera body, this thing just rocks. And you can look at other videos and their scientific tests, but you will see that this lens is absolutely crazy sharp for the price point. I think it's just over $400. It does have a lot of reach, especially on an APS-C camera. It's more like a 200mm compared to a full frame 200mm. For you film junkies out there, they actually do offer this with the serrated teeth, you know, and T stops instead of F stops. It's actually one of my favorite lenses. It's a Bokeh King. Even at f2, it is sharp as can be. I mean, really ridiculously sharp. I did not do enough research when I bought this. It is about the same price point, a little bit cheaper than the 85mm 1.8 Sony lens, which is about $500 to $600 depending on where you buy it or if you buy it used. And not as far as the reach as this, so if you need more reach, go with this lens, but the 85mm is actually very sharp. It is one of the sharpest kit lenses available, and its autofocus is native. I don't think it's as good as the 28mm, the one that I have on this lens right now. I'm actually in the middle of selling this lens to help me afford that 85mm. I'm gonna sell this one off and buy that 85mm, and that way I have more autofocus lenses that I can use for video and that I can use for headshots and photography and portraits. If you have the time to do manual focus, This lens is extremely powerful for its price point. Although amazing, may not be the best. We'll see when I buy my 85mm. I'm gonna go put this back real quick. Okay, so those are my recommendations, or rather my experience with lenses. You can take all the information that I have managed to spit out of my mouth today and apply it to your own purchases. If you're moving over to Sony from other cameras, if you're just looking for cheaper lenses for your camera. I understand f2.8 G Masters look amazing and they're so tempting, but you could buy my whole kit for the price of a 70-200 if you wanted to. Go online, do your own research. Thanks for listening to me talk. This has been fun. Go out and shoot. It's been raining a lot where I am. Provides an excellent opportunity to prove how much you want to shoot. And also it actually provides really decent lighting and just great landscape. Sometimes those clouds can get so big and pillowy and also ominous at the same time. It's really cool to have that kind of perfection in with the negative tones in the skies. I like it. I haven't been shooting enough. I'm sure a lot of you can relate. Go shoot. That's all I have to say for today. Have a good one.